Hey guys, tonight we're slipping into the soft, golden haze of 6th century Byzantium, specifically the life of a beekeeper. Not just any beekeeper, mind you, but one whose honey might end up on Emperor Justinian's breakfast table if you don't mess it up. You wake before dawn because bees, like emperors, don't appreciate tardiness. The air is thick with the scent of thyme and pine resin carried on a breeze from the distant hills. Your sandals crunch against dry earth as you approach the hives, stacked clay cylinders, each humming with a drowsy, irritable energy. You probably won't survive this job if you're allergic, but luckily Byzantine medicine has a very questionable remedy for that. We'll get to it later. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Your first task? Smoke the hives. Not for some arcane ritual, though there are plenty of those, but because agitated bees are not the vibe we're going for. You grab a handful of smoldering olive leaves, the smoke curling lazily in the cool morning air. The bees respond exactly as expected, grudgingly, like Byzantine tax collectors when you try to argue your way out of a levy. Here's a mainstream historical fact for you. Byzantine honey was legendary. The empire exported it as far as Francia and the Caliphate, where it sweetened everything from pastries to medicines. But here's the quirky tidbit. Some beekeepers believed their bees could predict the weather. A hive buzzing louder than usual? Rain's coming. Bees clustering at the entrance? Heatwave? Spoiler, they were sometimes right. Historians still argue whether Byzantine beekeepers actually talked to their bees or if that's just medieval romanticizing. But one thing's certain, if your hives failed, you weren't just out of a job. You might be out of a hand because imperial tax assessors weren't known for their patience. The morning inspection complete, you now faced the most tedious part of your day, Byzantine honey tax documentation. Yes, even bees weren't safe from imperial bureaucracy. As you sit cross-legged in your workshop, a cracked clay tablet and stylus in hand, you realize with sinking dread that you must account for every single amphora of honey produced this season. The penalty for underreporting? Let's just say the imperial treasury had creative ways of extracting payment. You scratch out the figures while a fat bee drifts lazily around your head, probably one of last year's veterans judging your poor math skills. The tax rates fluctuate based on the whims of whichever official last visited Constantinople, but this season it's 1 amphora in 5 for the imperial stores. Not terrible unless your hives had a bad year. Then it's the kind of math that keeps you awake at night, recalculating by firelight while nervously eyeing the road for tax collectors. Here's a mainstream fact. The Byzantine tax system was so meticulously organized that we still have surviving records of honey production quotas from the 6th century. But here's the bizarre twist. Some beekeepers hid their best honey in fake burial urns because grave robbing carried a lighter punishment than tax evasion. Historians still argue whether this was an actual loophole or just wishful thinking by desperate beekeepers. Either way, you're not risking it. You double-check your numbers as the sun climbs higher, the wax tablets growing sticky under your fingers. A distant church bell tolls third-hour prayers. Time to move the hives to the afternoon shade before the bees get cranky. The midday heat has settled like a wool blanket over the apiary and the bees have slowed to a drowsy murmur, perfect conditions for what comes next. Because while the imperial taxman cares only about quantity, the monks down at the monastery of St. Pantaleimon care very much about quality. Specifically, the secret mead recipe they've been perfecting since the days when Rome still had an emperor in the West. You wrap a damp cloth around your neck, Byzantine air conditioning, and begin the careful process of selecting which honeycombs are worthy of the monastery's famed hydromill. The best batches come from hives near the mountain wildflowers. Thyme and sage lend a medicinal sharpness the brothers insist wards off melancholy. Not that they'd ever admit this to the tax assessors, of course. Church honey is technically tax-exempt, provided it's used for sacramental purposes. Conveniently, the definition of sacramental gets very flexible around vintage batches. Here's a mainstream fact. Byzantine monasteries were the pharmaceutical labs of their day, using honey in everything from wound salves to sleep tonics. But here's the tidbit they don't teach in history class: some monks secretly added seaweed to their mead fermentation vats. Historians still argue whether this was an early attempt at mineral supplementation or just the result of a very creative or possibly drunk abbot. You tuck the chosen combs into a woven reed basket, the golden hexagons glistening like tiny stained glass windows. One of the older bees, you recognize her by the frayed wing edge, buzzes indignantly at the theft. Blame the tax code, you mutter, leaving an extra comb by her hive as peace offering. The walk to the monastery will take most of the afternoon, but the mead samples at journey's end make it worthwhile. That is, if Brother Methodios hasn't accidentally blessed this year's batch into extra potency again. The monastery courtyard smells of baking bread and something suspiciously like fermenting fruit as you arrive with your honeycombs. Brother Methodios greets you with his usual squint, half suspicion, half per eyesight, before thrusting a clay cup into your hands. Taste, he commands. It's not a request. The liquid inside is suspiciously dark for standard mead, with an oily sheen that catches the late afternoon light. You take a cautious sip. Your taste buds register 3 distinct phases. First, the expected honey sweetness, then herbal punch that makes your sinuses tingle, and finally, is that fish? You cough discreetly into your sleeve while Methodios watches with the satisfaction of a man who has just proven yet again that laypeople have no appreciation for advanced monastic chemistry. Sea buckthorn, he declares. From the marshes near Thessalonica. The physicians in Constantinople pay 6 numismata per amphora for this. Here's a mainstream fact. Byzantine monasteries were early adopters of evidence-based medicine with detailed records of treatments. But here's what they left out of the manuscripts: some monks tested their cures on unsuspecting visitors first. That lingering fishy aftertaste? Historians still argue whether it's from actual marine ingredients or just poorly filtered fermentation vessels that previously held garum, the empire's beloved fish sauce. You nod politely while discreetly setting the cup aside on a windowsill where some merciful sparrow might knock it over. The transaction complete: 3 combs for 2 jars of medicinal mead and 1 suspiciously squishy packet of digestive aids. You're almost out the gate when the abbot's voice stops you. The palace steward comes tomorrow, he murmurs. Best check your hives for impurities. The way his eyes dart toward the kitchen garden tells you everything. Someone's been feeding the bees something, and you'll be the one explaining it to the emperor's food taster. The palace steward's visit looms like a storm cloud over the horizon, so you spend the evening doing what any sensible Byzantine beekeeper would do, panic-checking every hive for impurities. You lift the lids one by one, the bees now sluggish in the evening coolness, their wings catching the last amber light of sunset. The 5th hive gives you pause. The honey here is bluer than it should be. Not the rich gold of mountain wildflowers, but a peculiar cerulean shade that would look beautiful in a mosaic and absolutely terrifying in an imperial breakfast bowl. You dip a finger in against your better judgment and taste. The flavor is unmistakable linden blossoms, but with a metallic aftertaste that makes your tongue feel oddly numb. Of course, the monk's medicinal sea buckthorn experiment has apparently migrated via determined bees who really should have minded their own business. You consider the options, confess and risk being accused of poisoning the imperial honey supply, or alternative solutions. Here's a mainstream fact. Byzantine food tasters were highly trained slaves who could detect over 50 known poisons. But here's the quirk: they were also notorious for taking bribes to overlook minor irregularities. Historians still argue whether this was institutional corruption or a pragmatic approach to food safety in an era when every dinner party was potentially lethal. You opt for the 3rd path: strategic dilution. The blue honey gets carefully blended with 3 batches of perfectly normal, definitely not numbing honey from your cousin's apiary across the valley. As you work by lamplight, a gecko watches from the wall with what you swear is judgment. Quiet, you mutter. At least I'm not the one who has to explain to Justinian why his breakfast honey makes his lips tingle. Dawn arrives with the rhythmic clatter of hooves on the packed earth road, the imperial inspector's party cresting the hill in a cloud of dust and self-importance. You straighten your tunic, the one without wax stains, reserved for exactly these occasions, and try not to think about the still slightly blue-tinged honey amphorae lined up by the storage shed. The steward himself dismounts with the grace of a man who spends more time counting coins than writing, his silk-lined cloak hopelessly impractical for farm inspections. Production records he demands without preamble, snapping his fingers at the slave trailing behind him with a wax tablet. You hand over your carefully doctored figures, the real numbers minus exactly 1/5, plus a little extra because everyone knows imperial measures run generous. The steward squints at the totals, then at you, then at the nearest hive where several bees have gathered as if to bear witness. Here's a mainstream fact. Byzantine officials used standardized bronze measurement vessels to assess goods, but they were famously adjustable depending on how much silver changed hands beforehand. But here's the tidbit even the bribes couldn't hide. Some inspectors carried their own lucky measuring cups, slightly larger or smaller depending on whether they liked your face. Historians still argue whether this was corruption or just really personalized customer service. The inspection proceeds with all the tension of a tightrope walk over the hippodrome. The steward samples honey straight from the comb. You hold your breath as he licks the blue adjacent batch, sniffs at your storage jars, and just when you think you're safe, asks to see the bees. Not the hives. The actual bees. As if you've got them lined up like miniature soldiers awaiting review. You're saved by an actual miracle, a sudden downpour that sends everyone scrambling for cover, the steward's silk cloak immediately proving its worthlessness in rain.